Oak Haven, California, Friday night. A woman is watching her brother steal her life. My name is Miriam Douglas, and I am standing in the suffocating heat of a backstage wing, clutching a phone that holds $1 billion secret. Beyond the velvet curtain, 500 people are cheering for a tech empire I built from nothing. Yet the name on the trophy isn't mine. It is my brother's. My father told me I had to be erased to save the family. He called my silence a sacrifice. But tonight I have to decide if I am going to remain a ghost in my own history or walk out onto that stage and burn the script down. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Here is the story of how I took my name back. The backstage area of the Oak Haven Civic Center was suffocatingly hot, smelling of hairspray, cheap cologne, and the stale dust of heavy velvet curtains. Beyond the partition, 500 people were murmuring, waiting for the town's Hometown Legacy Awards to begin. I stood in the shadows, clutching my phone like a lifeline, my thumb hovering over a notification that had just lit up the screen. It was my CFO, Naomi. She wouldn't be calling at 7:00 p.m. on a Friday unless the final IPO numbers were in. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm that had nothing to do with stage fright and everything to do with the man standing 5 feet away from me. My father, Richard Douglas, adjusted his tie in the mirror, catching my reflection. He didn't smile. He just glared at the phone in my hand, his eyes narrowing into that familiar, disappointed slit that made me feel 6 years old again. He flicked his head toward my pocket, a silent command to put the device away. Beside him stood my brother Caleb. He looked every inch the visionary entrepreneur of the year. The program claimed he was square-jawed, charismatic, and completely at ease accepting an award for a tech company he hadn't built. I was the one who wrote the code. I was the one who stayed up until 4:00 a.m. debugging the algorithms. But tonight I was just the sister in the background, the support staff, the prop. A year ago, my parents told me they had to sacrifice me to save the family. Tonight, staring at my father's rigid back, I was about to find out exactly what they meant by that. But to understand why I was standing there shaking and silent, while my brother prepared to take credit for my life's work, I have to take you back to the first time my father ambushed me. Growing up, the Douglas name was currency in our small California town. You couldn't walk through the grocery store without someone stopping my dad to thank him for a renovation or ask about the high school football schedule. Richard Douglas was the local hero, loud, charismatic, the kind of general contractor who shook your hand and made you feel like you were the most important person in the room, unless, of course, you were his daughter. In the ecosystem of our family, everyone had a role. Dad was the leader. Mom Elaine was the peacekeeper, a woman who had mastered the art of conflict avoidance so thoroughly she seemed to fade into the beige wallpaper she kept putting up. And Caleb. Caleb was the golden boy, the star quarterback, the homecoming king, the one Dad looked at with a hunger that said, "This is my legacy." Then there was me, Miriam. I was bookish, quiet, and deeply uncomfortable with the aggressive loud talk of Friday night football. I found my home inside the logic of machines. While Caleb was running drills, I was teaching myself Python on a refurbished laptop I'd bought from a school surplus sale. I loved the clean, predictable rules of code. If you made a mistake, the computer told you. It didn't gaslight you. It just gave you an error message you could fix. People were messy. Algorithms were safe. But in Richard Douglas's house, safety was a luxury we couldn't afford. The first time I truly understood my place in the hierarchy, I was 14. We were at the dinner table, the air thick with the smell of pot roast, and Dad's monologue about the varsity team's defensive line. I had been waiting for a pause for 20 minutes. Finally, when Dad stopped to take a breath, I pulled a crumpled certificate out from under my placemat. I had won first place in a statewide coding competition for a program that organized library databases. It came with a $50 check and a letter from a university dean. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "look, I won state." Dad glanced at the paper. He didn't pick it up. He just nudged it aside with his fork so he could reach the salt shaker. That's cute, Miriam, he said, not looking me in the eye. But let's keep our heads out of the clouds. Caleb had scouts from USC at practice today. That's real. That's a future. But this is a future too, I argued, the desperation rising in my throat. It's engineering. Dad set his fork down. The table went silent. Mom stared at her peas. Don't get carried away, he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that meant the conversation was over. This family can't bet on you, Miriam. You live in that laptop. The real world happens out here where leaders are made. Don't ask us to invest in a hobby. That night, I learned that family first and loyalty words my father preached like gospel were weapons. They were used to demand submission, not to offer support. I realized that in my parents' eyes, I was the expendable asset. I was the one who could be sacrificed so the resources could flow to the real investment, Caleb. I stopped showing them my grades. I stopped talking about my code. I quietly began to dream of building something so big and so independent that they could never threaten to cut me off again. I thought I was just being an angsty teenager, but the confirmation came 3 years later. I was coming down the stairs late at night for a glass of water when I heard low voices in the kitchen. "You're the one I'm proud of, son," my father was saying. I froze on the landing. "Miriam. She's too sensitive. She overthinks. She'll probably vanish into some weird tech job and forget us. We have to be realistic. If we ever have to choose, we'll always choose you. You're the legacy." I retreated to my room, my heart cold in my chest. At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic. I didn't know my parents would someday take that promise literally. I didn't know they were already drafting the blueprint to erase me on paper. The acceptance letter to one of the country's top computer science programs felt heavy in my hands, like a physical anchor to a life I hadn't lived yet. When I showed it to my father, expecting perhaps a flicker of the pride he rationed so strictly, he didn't even look up from his invoices. He just sighed, the sound loud and abrasive in the quiet kitchen. "Tuition isn't cheap, Miriam," he grumbled, finally glancing at the university logo with disdain. "You're asking us to throw good money after a hobby. You could stay here, work the front desk for the construction business. Hell, Caleb's going to need an assistant when he starts running things. That's a real job." That suggestion that my destiny was to file papers for the brother who had never written a line of code or balanced a ledger in his life was the spark that finally burned the bridge. I packed my bags the next morning. I didn't ask for a dime. I pieced together a fragile patchwork of scholarships, teaching assistant stipends, and late-night freelance coding gigs to pay my way. I survived on caffeine and the stubborn, quiet religion of personal freedom. Every bill I paid myself was a brick in a wall I was building between me and them. But distance didn't stop the narrative they were spinning back home. While I was grinding through 18-hour days, eyes burning from staring at monitors, I'd see my mother's Facebook posts. They were endless tributes to their own generosity. They posted about how much they were sacrificing to fund Caleb's MBA, how they were providing the seed money for his vague business dreams. They were martyrs for his potential, while I was effectively invisible. The disparity became concrete the winter of my sophomore year when my old laptop finally died. It was catastrophic. I had finals due and freelance deadlines looming. I swallowed my pride and called home asking for a small short-term loan just to replace the machine. Richard didn't hesitate. "We can't drain the family resources for your experiments, Miriam," he said, his voice flat. "Caleb needs capital for his networking trips. We help where it counts. You have to understand priorities." That was the moment the word family stopped sounding like a sanctuary and started sounding like a cage. I realized I wasn't just the black sheep. I was the scapegoat they felt entitled to starve so the golden calf could feast. I hung up, took an extra shift at the campus IT help desk, and bought a used machine. I swore then that I would never ask them for anything ever again. By the time I hit grad school, that chip on my shoulder had solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. I joined a research lab focusing on something unglamorous but vital: AI tools for small business management. I was fascinated by the idea of helping people like the contractors my dad worked with, people who were great at their trade, but terrible at cash flow. I started a side project, an AI-driven platform designed to predict demand, streamline staffing, and prevent small business bankruptcy. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. It solved real problems. At a university demo day, I presented the prototype. The room was full of students pitching flashy social media apps and crypto schemes, but a venture capitalist in a gray blazer made a beeline for my booth. He looked at my messy code and the simple interface and said the words that changed my life. "You're solving a boring problem that costs people billions. You could build a real company out of this." That sentence was the seed. I started working obsessively, treating the project not as homework, but as the foundation of a future empire. But when I called home during the holidays, trying to bridge the gap one last time, the conversation followed the same toxic script. I tried to explain the predictive modeling, how it could save businesses from going under. Richard cut me off with a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Stop talking like a robot, Miriam. Nobody cares about algorithms. Get a job that makes sense. Caleb's got this entrepreneurial spirit. He's talking to investors about a lifestyle brand. That's what people want." I went silent. I realized he would never hear me. To him, I was just noise. That was the moment I stopped trying to make sense to them. I whispered to the empty room after I hung up. And I started building something just for myself. A month later, I officially incorporated my startup. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't put it on social media. I sat alone in a coffee shop signing the digital documents with shaking hands. I signed the first term sheet for seed funding right there next to a half-empty latte. For the first time in my life, I belonged entirely to myself. The silence from my phone felt like a victory. I didn't know then that my parents were already watching, waiting, and planning a way to claim this victory too. I walked out into the cool night air, believing I was free, unaware that I had just signed the papers that would eventually lead them to ambush me when I was at my most vulnerable. The early days of my startup weren't the glossy montage scenes you see in movies. There were no high fives in glass-walled offices. It was 20-hour days spent in a cramped, windowless sublet that smelled perpetually of instant ramen and overheating servers. I slept on the floor under my desk more nights than I slept in my own bed, waking up with keyboard patterns imprinted on my cheek to debug code at 3:00 a.m. But despite the exhaustion, there was a magic to it. My team was a ragtag group of misfits engineers from 3 different continents, a designer who had dropped out of art school, and a data scientist who lived in a van. We were tired, broke, and relentless, but we supported each other. For the first time, I understood what a family was supposed to feel like. It wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about shared purpose. And it was working. Our pilot programs were stabilizing revenue for 3 local construction firms and a struggling bakery. When the data came back showing we had saved them from bankruptcy, I felt a profound sense of impact that no award on a shelf could match. But success, even in its infancy, makes noise. And that noise eventually traveled back to the one place I was trying to outrun. Word of my small seed funding round reached my hometown through the gossip mill, probably a banker who knew my father. Suddenly, Richard Douglas was calling me, not to criticize, but to chat. His voice on the phone was jarringly warm. "So my girl is doing something big after all," he said, the static on the line unable to hide the calculation in his tone. "We're proud of you, Miriam. You should come home this weekend. Let's celebrate the family." I should have known better. I should have heard the trap snapping shut in that invitation. But the little girl inside me, the one still holding that coding certificate at the dinner table, just wanted her dad to look at her with something other than disappointment. So I drove home. The ambush happened on Sunday afternoon. I walked into the living room to find a tableau that felt staged. Richard sat in his leather armchair, Elaine was perched nervously on the edge of the sofa, and Caleb was leaning against the mantel looking solemn. On the coffee table, dead center, sat a neat stack of legal documents. "Sit down, Miriam," Dad said. It wasn't a request. He started a monologue about the family economy. He talked about how hard the last few years had been, how much they had extended themselves to pay for Caleb's MBA and the seed money for his various lifestyle brand ideas that hadn't quite launched yet. "We're under a lot of strain," Richard said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "We might lose the house. We sacrificed everything for you kids. We backed you. Now you have a chance to back the family." He pushed the stack of papers toward me. "It's a simple protection agreement," he explained. "A family trust. It just ensures that if your little company ever sells or if you get sued, the assets are safe within the family. It protects you, and it keeps us all afloat." I picked up the document. The legalese was dense, but the pressure in the room was heavier. "Dad, I have investors now," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't just sign over equity or control without—" "It's not about control, it's about safety," Richard boomed, standing up. The warm facade dropped instantly. "We've always supported you. We fed you, clothed. You put a roof over your head while you played on your computer. Now you're too big to help your mother keep her house." He pointed a finger at me, his face reddening. "If you can't even sign a piece of paper to protect your own blood, maybe we really did raise the wrong daughter." That line hit me like a physical blow. The guilt was suffocating. I looked at Mom, but she just dabbed at her eyes, looking away. I looked at Caleb, and he gave me a small, pitying shrug. I felt cornered, terrified of being the villain in their story, the ungrateful child who let the family ruin itself. I didn't read the fine print. I just wanted the yelling to stop. I wanted to be good. I picked up the pen and signed. I didn't know then what I was actually doing. I didn't know that hidden in the intentionally convoluted legal language, the trust claimed a controlling interest in my intellectual property and future equity. I didn't know it named Richard as the sole trustee with the power to make executive decisions, and Caleb as the primary successor beneficiary. I didn't hear what Richard whispered to Caleb in the kitchen while I was putting my shoes on to leave. "If Miriam's thing hits," he told my brother, "it'll be under our name. She doesn't understand real business anyway. We'll take it from here." I left that weekend feeling a sick knot in my stomach, but telling myself I had done the right thing. I drove away believing I had helped save my parents. I didn't realize I had just signed the papers they would use to try and erase me completely. As I pulled out of the driveway, the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was my father holding that folder, tapping it against his palm, satisfied. 2 years later, the silence between me and my family had become a comfortable, if somewhat melancholy, norm. While they were back in Oak Haven posting vague updates about Caleb's market research, my life had exploded into a reality I barely recognized. We had closed our Series B funding, and the startup that began in a basement now occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise. I employed dozens of people, many of them remote workers from small towns just like the one I grew up in. I wasn't just building software, I was keeping family businesses alive across the country. Every time a bakery in Ohio or a mechanic in Texas used our platform to survive a lean month, I felt a vindication that no approval from my father could ever match. I kept my parents at arm's length, speaking to them only on holidays, protecting the peace I had fought so hard to build. But peace built on a lie is just a waiting game. The truth arrived on a Tuesday morning in a glass-walled conference room during the final stages of due diligence for our potential IPO. My CFO, Naomi, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had become the older sister I never had, was sitting with our legal counsel looking at a spreadsheet projected on the wall. The mood, usually electric with the excitement of going public, was dead silent. "Miriam," Naomi said, her voice careful, "we have a problem with the cap table. Who is the trustee for the Douglas Family Trust?" I blinked, confused. That's just a safety net my dad set up years ago. It's dormant. It was just for family protection." The lawyer slid a thick binder across the table. "It's not dormant, Miriam, and it's not a safety net. According to these filings, the trust holds a significant equity stake in the company. But here's the kicker. Richard Douglas is listed as the sole trustee with voting power, and Caleb Douglas is the primary controlling beneficiary upon any liquidity event." The room seemed to tilt. I opened the binder, reading the lines they had highlighted. The legal jargon I had blindly signed in my parents' living room wasn't about protecting the house. It was a transfer of power. My father hadn't secured my safety, he had secured his control. If we went public, the structure I had signed allowed him to step and vote my shares and effectively hand the financial windfall and the credit to Caleb. I felt the ambush all over again, but this time it played out in slow motion. I saw the pattern with agonizing clarity. Family was the word they used when they needed to take something from me. Sacrifice was the demand they made when they wanted me to disappear. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had built a trap for my success before it even happened. My hands shaking, I dialed my father's number. I needed to hear him say it. I needed to know if he understood what he had done. He answered on the second ring, cheerful. Miriam, long time no talk. Dad. I cut him off, my voice trembling. I'm looking at the trust documents. You made yourself the trustee. You made Caleb the beneficiary of my company. Why? The cheerfulness evaporated instantly. We're protecting you, Miriam. You know how high pressure this business stuff is. If things go south, we take the hit. That's what fathers do. You're not taking a hit, I yelled, the tears finally spilling over. You're taking my company. You set this up to give Caleb my work. You'd be nothing without the way we raised you, he shouted back, the gaslighting coming fast and practiced. Don't be ungrateful. We gave you the values that built that place. The least you can do is ensure the family is taken care of. Elaine, I heard him yell away from the phone. Talk some sense into your daughter. I heard my mother in the background, her voice weak and pleading. Miriam, please. Your dad just did what he thought was best for the family. Don't fight him. I hung up. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. A cold, hard calm settled over me, the kind of calm I used when debugging a catastrophic system failure. I wasn't going to let them break me. I was going to fix the bug. I looked at Naomi and the lawyers. Fix it, I said. Find a way out. For the next 3 weeks, we went to war quietly. We dug through every email, every text message, every interaction I'd had with my family since the signing. We found the loopholes in the trust's language regarding active management. But we found something even better. My legal team uncovered emails where Richard and Caleb had tried to shop around my product idea to local investors as their own, using the trust as proof of ownership, claiming I was just a technical consultant. It was fraud. It was a breach of fiduciary duty. My revenge wouldn't be physical. I wasn't going to slash tires or scream in their driveway. My revenge would be absolute, undeniable truth. Naomi walked into my office a week later, holding a sleek, cream-colored invitation card. Our IPO roadshow dates are set, she said, a wicked glint in her eye. The stock goes live on the exchange next Friday morning. Coincidentally, isn't that the same day as this? She tossed the invitation onto my desk. It was for the Hometown Legacy Gala. The text was embossed in gold, honoring Caleb Douglas, Visionary Entrepreneur of the Year. I looked at the invitation. Caleb was receiving an award for leading the tech revolution I had built. They wanted to erase me, quietly buried under paperwork and family guilt. I picked up the card. They wanted a silent partner, I told Naomi. But if the truth is coming out, it won't be quiet. The air in the Oak Haven Civic Center was stifling, recycled through vents that hadn't been cleaned since the 90s. I sat at a round table near the back of the room, far away from the dais where my father and brother were currently holding court. I looked down at the glossy program in my hands. There, printed in bold font under Hometown Legacy Award, was Caleb's name, and underneath it, in a font so small you almost had to squint to see it, was a single-line special, thanks to Miriam Douglas, technical consultant. That was it. That was my erasure in black and white. I was the ghost in the machine, the invisible engine that had powered the vehicle Caleb was now driving into the spotlight. I felt that old familiar ache in my chest, the feeling of screaming underwater where no one could hear you. Then my phone buzzed against the tablecloth. It was Naomi. I picked it up, glancing toward the front of the room where the mayor was tapping the microphone. I brought the phone to my ear, and through the receiver, Naomi's voice cut through the ambient noise of the gala like a razor. "The IPO just went live, Miriam," she said, her voice trembling with an adrenaline that had nothing to do with fear. "We priced high. The market opened 3 minutes ago. Miriam, we just crossed a $5.8 billion valuation, and it's climbing." My breath hitched. I sat frozen, the number echoing in my head. Billion. Not million. Billion. The couple at the table next to me, a local real estate agent and his wife, stopped mid-conversation. They had overheard. I saw the word billion register on their faces, followed by a confused look at me, the girl in the back row. But before I could process the magnitude of what Naomi had just said, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. It was Richard. He had come down from the stage during the video interlude, his face flushed with annoyance. "Put that away," he hissed, leaning in close so the donors nearby wouldn't hear. "Don't embarrass Caleb tonight. Whatever little corporate thing you're doing, keep it quiet. This is his night." He squeezed my shoulder hard. It was a warning. "After everything we sacrificed for you, Miriam, the least you can do is not steal your brother's moment. Be a good sister for once." The video montage ended. The spotlight swung to the stage where Caleb was adjusting his tie, ready to accept the award for visionary leadership. My phone buzzed again. Naomi was calling back. I looked at my father. I looked at Caleb standing in the light I had built for him. Then I looked at the phone. I didn't silence it. I didn't hide it. I pressed answer, and then with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I hit the speaker button. I set the phone on the table between us. Naomi's voice, loud and clear, projected into the sudden lull of the room. She didn't know she was on speaker. "Miriam, are you there? The news outlets are picking it up. Congratulations. You are officially one of the youngest self-made tech billionaires in the country. And the board just approved the transfer for your foundation funding for underprivileged kids in rural towns, just like you wanted." The silence that followed was absolute. It started at our table and rippled outward like a shockwave. The real estate agent gasped audibly. Richard's face went slack, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Caleb, up on stage, looked down, confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. The MC, a local news anchor who smelled a scoop, looked from the stage to me. It seems we have another Douglas making headlines tonight," he stammered into the microphone, gesturing vaguely toward me. "Miriam, is that true?" The spotlight swiveled. It hit me blindingly bright. I stood up. Richard, recovering his wits, plastered a terrified fake smile on his face and grabbed my arm, trying to hoist it up like a boxing referee. "Well, you know," he boomed, his voice cracking slightly. "It's a family effort. We always believed in her. We built this together." He was doing it. He was pivoting in real time, rewriting the narrative to claim ownership of the victory he had tried to prevent. I pulled my arm out of his grip. It was a small movement, but it felt like breaking a chain. I walked past him. I walked up the stairs to the stage, taking the microphone from a stunned Caleb. I looked out at the crowd, the neighbors, the teachers, the people who had watched me grow up in my brother's shadow. "My father says this was a family effort," I said, my voice echoing through the hall. "But the truth is, I built this company. I coded it in a basement while my family told me I was wasting my time. I funded it myself when my parents refused to help because they were saving their money for the real leader." I gestured to Caleb, who looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. I turned to look directly at Richard, who was now pale as a sheet. "I signed a trust 2 years ago because I was told it would save this family. I found out last week it was designed to give my brother control of my life's work. So my lawyers voided it this morning. We found the emails, Dad. We found the evidence of you trying to sell my IP as your own. The trust is gone. The company is mine." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. "My parents tried to erase me on paper," I said, delivering the final blow, not with anger, but with a cold, absolute clarity. "Tonight, I'm just putting my name back where it always belonged." I placed the microphone back on the stand. I didn't look at Caleb. I didn't look at the audience. I walked down the stairs and headed for the exit, leaving the room in stunned, heavy silence. I glanced back once just for a second to see my father's face draining of color and the audience turning to him, waiting for an answer he didn't have. I thought watching his mask crack would feel like revenge. What it actually felt like was loss. The moment I stepped off the stage, the gala didn't just end. It dissolved into a chaotic storm of whispers, camera flashes, and the shuffling of feet as the town's elite tried to decide which side of history they wanted to stand on. The polite applause that usually filled the Civic Center was replaced by a low, buzzing murmur that felt dangerous. I walked down the aisle, my head high, but my legs felt like lead. Behind me, I could hear the heavy tread of my father trying to catch up his breath, ragged. As we neared the exit, the community the people Richard Douglas had charmed for 30 years began to fracture. A local hardware store owner, a man who had known my dad since high school, stepped into the aisle, blocking our path. He didn't look at me, he looked at Richard. "Is it true, Rich?" he asked, his voice cutting through the din. "Did you really try to take her company after she built it?" "It's a misunderstanding." Richard barked, his face a mottled red sweat beading on his forehead. "Family business is complicated. You don't air dirty laundry like this." "She's a billionaire, Richard," someone else shouted from a nearby table. "Sounds like she knows business better than you." Security guards, sensing the volatility of the room, flanked us. They ushered my parents, Caleb and me, into a small beige conference room off the main hallway, a holding cell for the disgraced. The heavy door clicked shut, muffling the roar of the crowd outside, but the silence inside was far louder. Richard didn't wait for the guards to leave before he erupted. He spun on his heel, his finger stabbing the air toward my face. "How could you?" he screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. "You just destroyed this family, in front of everyone, in front of the mayor. Do you have any idea how long it took me to build that reputation?" "Richard, please," my mother sobbed, collapsing into a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, a woman whose entire world was collapsing because she had bet everything on the wrong lie. "Don't Richard me, Elaine," he snapped, then turned back to me. "You chose strangers over your own blood. You humiliated your brother. You humiliated me. And for what? Money? You think that money makes you better than us?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a giant. I saw a terrified small man who had built a kingdom on sand. "It wasn't about the money, Dad," I said, my voice frighteningly calm. "And it wasn't about humiliation. It was about the truth." "Truth?" he scoffed. "The truth is we protected you." "No," I cut him off, stepping forward. "You didn't protect me. You sacrificed me. You threatened my future to secure Caleb's. You told me I was the expendable one. That isn't love, Dad. That's control." The room went deadly quiet. Even Elaine's sobbing hitched. "I tried so hard to be the daughter you wanted." I continued, the words pouring out from a deep pressurized well in my chest. "When I started making money 2 years ago, who do you think paid off the lien on the house? Who paid the credit card debt you ran up funding Caleb's lifestyle brand? I did. Anonymously. I sent the checks through a lawyer so you wouldn't have to feel small. I kept trying to buy your pride, and every time I came home, you ambushed me with demands for more." Caleb, who had been staring at the floor, finally looked up. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked from me to our father, the realization washing over him like a cold tide. He had been the beneficiary of a theft he hadn't fully understood until this moment. "You paid the lien," Caleb whispered. "I paid everything," I said. "And all I wanted in return was for you not to steal the one thing that was actually mine." Richard slumped against the wall, his bravado finally cracking. He ran a hand over his face. "I only did what I thought a father should do," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I had to ensure the legacy survived. I had to make sure the family was strong." I shook my head, feeling a profound wave of pity. He still didn't get it. He was still the hero in his own story, making the tough calls, unable to see me as anything other than a resource to be managed. You didn't strengthen the family, Dad. You broke it. Then Caleb stepped between us. He looked at Richard, then at me. I knew, he said, his voice shaking. I mean, I didn't know about the trust details, not really. But I knew you were the smart one, Miriam. And I knew they were pushing you down to lift me up. And I let them. He took a deep breath, tears spilling onto his cheeks. I let them sacrifice you because it felt good to be the favorite. I'm so sorry. He turned to Dad. I'm done, Dad. I'm not accepting the award. I'm issuing a statement tomorrow. Miriam founded the company. Miriam did the work. I'm not going to be the face of a lie anymore. Richard looked at Caleb as if he'd been slapped. His golden boy, his legacy, was walking away. I didn't wait for Richard's response. I didn't wait for him to try and spin this new reality. I turned to the door. I'm done asking you to see me, I said, my hand on the latch. I walked out of that side room, leaving them in the beige silence of their own making. I walked past the security guards and out the back exit into the cool night air. For the first time in my life, I left a room without wondering if my parents were proud of me. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I only wondered if I'd ever be able to feel anything for them except this heavy, tired kind of grief. It has been exactly a year since the gala, and the silence in my life has finally settled into a rhythm I can breathe to. I live in a modest house on the coast now, a few hours north of the city. It's nothing like the sprawling columned estate my father always dreamed of building. My walls aren't covered with awards or posed family portraits where everyone is smiling through gritted teeth. Instead, they're covered in whiteboards filled with scribbled code maps of our new regional hubs and art from the local community center. For the first time, my home looks like the inside of my brain, not a stage set for someone else's play. My company is thriving larger than I ever dared to imagine during those nights, sleeping on the floor of my sublet. We have offices in 6 states, and our software is the backbone for thousands of small businesses that would have otherwise gone under. But the work I'm most proud of isn't the stock price or the quarterly earnings calls. It's the scholarship program I launched 3 months after the IPO. We call it the Outlier Fund. It's specifically designed for the kids who are told they are too much, too quiet, too weird, or simply not worth betting on, the kids whose families, like mine, tried to erase them to fit a more convenient narrative. My own family is different now. The fracture that happened in that conference room didn't heal, but it stopped bleeding. I am low contact with Richard. He never fully accepted responsibility for what he did. He never sat me down and said, I was wrong to sacrifice you. He only accepted the consequences because he had no choice. He lives in a smaller house now, his reputation in town bruised, but not broken, because people like my father always find a way to spin the story. But he doesn't have power over me anymore, and that has to be enough. Elaine calls me on Sundays. Usually she calls when Dad is out at the hardware store. We talk about the weather or her garden or the ocean. She is slowly, painfully learning how to ask, "How are you, Miriam?" instead of, "What would your father say about this?" It's a fragile relationship built on the ruins of the old one, but it's real. And then there's Caleb. The brother I spent my life resenting has become the person I trust most to help run the foundation. He stepped down from the visionary role, publicly admitting he was just the face of a machine I built. It was the hardest thing he ever did, but it made him a man. He volunteers with the scholarship kids, now telling them his side of the story, warning them about the dangers of letting someone else hand you a life you didn't earn. He finally sees me, and because of that, I can finally see him as a brother, not a rival. Sometimes late at night, I sit on my deck and listen to the ocean reflecting on the American values my father preached at the dinner table until they sounded like threats: hard work, family, freedom. I realize now that I didn't reject those values. I just reclaimed them. I lived the hard work while he talked about it. He weaponized family to demand submission while I found a real family in the team I built. And freedom. Freedom wasn't something he could give me as a reward for being good. Freedom was something I had to claim. I don't frame my story as the girl who became a billionaire. I frame it as the girl who stopped letting anyone else write her name out of her own life. This morning I received a letter that brought it all full circle. It was from a 16-year-old girl in a rural town in Nebraska, one of the first recipients of our coding camp scholarship. She wrote, "My parents don't really understand what I do. They think I'm wasting my time on computers when I should be focusing on things that matter. But hearing your story makes me feel less alone. It makes me feel like I exist." I sat there at my kitchen island, tears stinging my eyes, recognizing my younger self in her messy handwriting. That feeling of invisibility is a heavy coat to wear, and helping her take it off meant more to me than any check I could ever cash. If there is anyone listening to this who feels like they are being edited out of their own story, if your parents, your family, or your community are trying to erase you because you don't fit the role they picked, remember this. You are allowed to walk away from the script they wrote. You are allowed to tear up the contract. You are allowed to write your own name in ink in big, bold letters where they can't miss it. I walked over to the drawer in my desk and pulled out a small, faded photograph I found while unpacking. It was from a county fair 20 years ago. Me, Caleb, and Richard. Dad looks happy in the photo, holding a giant stuffed bear he'd won for Caleb, while I stood off to the side looking at the camera with wide, serious eyes. I looked at it for a long moment. I didn't feel anger. I just felt a quiet sense of distance, like looking at a stranger. I placed the photo back in the drawer and closed it gently. My father spent years telling me I was on my own. He was right about that part. What he never understood is that being on my own was never a threat. It was my freedom. And so Miriam Douglas closes the drawer on the past, proving that sometimes the hardest battles are fought within our own homes. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and justice, please hit that subscribe button and share your perspective below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.